Good morning, Centurion Vineyard Church family, and welcome to another week of devotions with us. This week, we're going to be looking at the times where Jesus spoke peace to people in various circumstances and situations. As we get going, to say that we're all aware of the turmoil and strife in the world around us is probably not necessary. In fact, it's probably an understatement. And I know that there's always been turmoil, there's always been strife, there have always been issues in the world, right the way throughout human history. But doesn't it seem as if since the end of last year, everything just seems to be happening all at once? There's COVID-19 and the resulting effect and impact that this disease has had on economies and markets all over the world. There's the consequences of this, including job losses and the uncertainties that go along with it. Added to this, there are the issues of racism and Black Lives Matter that are sweeping around the world too. Then, in South Africa, we have our own self-proclaimed second pandemic of gender-based violence. Added to this, there's rising tensions in the Middle East. There's rising tensions between China and Russia. And now there's news coming out of China that there is a new strain of swine flu coming from China that is supposed to be stronger and worse than the H1N1 virus was. And over and above all of this, many of us are facing turmoil and storms in our own personal lives, and we are just trying to deal with that. So where do we turn to? Who do we turn to? What are we to do during times like this? Could I suggest that we do what the disciples eventually did when they were facing a storm, that we turn to the person that they eventually turned to when they couldn't do anymore, Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. In Mark 4, verses 35 to 41, we read the story of when Jesus and the disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee. Now, to put things into perspective, before they started crossing, Jesus had just spent a full day teaching the crowds. And Mark says he spoke using many parables. Just think of the mental strain that took to think of parable after parable after parable. And that done, he has to explain it all to the disciples because the disciples did not know what the parables meant. It is after a day like this, a full day, that Jesus says to the disciples, let's get into the boat and go over to the other side. And so they do. And exhausted, Jesus climbs into the boat and falls almost immediately asleep. It's nighttime as they climb into the boat and start crossing. Now, the disciples wouldn't have been worried about that because the fishermen among them would have known that night is the best time to fish on the Sea of Galilee. But all of a sudden, the unexpected happens, and a storm comes up and catches them unaware. It's just like what we're experiencing in the world, in our lives today, isn't it? This storm was uncommon, it was not normal, it was unexpected, and it had the disciples terrified, afraid, scared. Remember, there were experienced fishermen among them, and even they, after everything that they knew how to do, did not know what else to do. So they did the only thing that they could think of to do. They woke Jesus up. "Teacher," they cried out, "don't you care if we drown?" Here's the question. How often, when we're going through rough seas, rough situations in our own lives, do we ask the same question? Jesus, don't you care about me? And yet we know that he does. Because like he was with the disciples in the boat, he is with us in and through our lives. Now, coming back to the passage, Jesus gets up and he does something the disciples weren't expecting. He speaks. He speaks to the storm, and I personally believe that he was speaking to the disciples at the same time. He must have been a little bit annoyed that they woke him up from a good sleep. The Revised Standard Version says, he says, "Peace, be still." And not only does the storm stop, but I also believe at that moment, so did the disciples. They stopped in their tracks. I mean, Jesus had just stopped a storm dead. Wouldn't that also get your attention? and cause you to stop and take notice as the disciples did? Let me ask you, what storm are you facing today? What turmoil is there in your life? Could I encourage you to cry out to Jesus? Could I encourage you to stop doing what you think you have to do and what you think that you can do to get yourself out of the storm? And just let Jesus speak into the situation. Let Jesus speak into your life. Could I also encourage you to add your voice to the millions around the world and cry out to Jesus to speak peace to the turmoil that is all around us? Today, as you do that, I pray that you would hear His voice loud and clear. Peace, be still.